According to PETA.org, Gandhi states that the greatness of a nation and its moral progress can be judged by the way its animals are treated. So, what does that say about us when we already have close to 7,000 endangered species today? And that's according to the IUCNRedList.org. The Endangered Species Act of 1973, or the ESA, has been created to protect the endangered species from going extinct. The ESA's purpose statement is to provide a means whereby the ecosystems upon which endangered species and threatened species depend may be conserved. Basically, they were designed to recover a species to the point where they no longer needed the Act's protection anymore. Despite the ESA's best intentions, they have been proven to be ineffective in the conservation of endangered species. At this point, you're probably asking yourself, well, why should I care? It doesn't really affect me, right? Well, it does. It affects your children if you have children, or your future children if you don't already have children. It's really hard to imagine our world and our society without the presence of our beloved animals such as elephants and panda bears. But that could soon become our reality if the ESA remains the same. The reason I know so much about the ESA is because during my senior year of high school, I had to write a research paper regarding the preservation and conservation of endangered species, and to do that I needed to research and become familiar with the ESA first. So today I will be walking you guys through the problems, the effects, and the solutions of the ESA laws. The first problem, according to eoearth.org, is that the ESA only protects the habitat in which endangered species lives. Well, automatically that's a huge red flag, because while protecting the habitat is an important aspect of protecting a species, it should not be the primary focus of the ESA to begin with. Next, the ESA punishes landowners and creates incentives for those landowners to destroy endangered wildlife living on their property. And the last problem, according to the National Center for Policy Analysis, is that no species has ever fully recovered or been delisted solely because of the ESA. With that alone, it's clear to see that the ESA is not doing the job it set out to do. So now that we've covered the problems of the ESA, we can then move on to some effects. The first effect is that endangered species are either continuing to decline in their numbers or making no progress at all, both of which, may I remind you, is not the goal of the ESA. The second effect is that landowners, since they are being restricted by the ESA, they are unknowingly killing off more endangered species by not providing them compensation for their land. This creates more killing off of endangered species, and the ESA is unknowingly supporting it. The last effect is that endangered species will continue to receive inadequate protection under the ESA, and by that I mean just protecting the habitat in which they live is not enough protection for a species that could go extinct at any moment. So now that we've talked about some effects of the ESA, we can then move on to some solutions and how to fix it. So the solution is simple. The ESA needs to revise their rules and regulations regarding endangered species. And one way to do this is to introduce private protection. And according to the Thorough Institute, private protection would be ideal because it could help increase endangered species numbers who are drastically low. One way private protection would work is through captive breeding. And while that may sound horrible, captive breeding is essentially just taking an endangered species and breeding them in a controlled environment. This makes it safe both for the animal and for the human. While this may not be the best long-term solution that we have to offer, it is by far one of the best short-term solutions for endangered species whose numbers are very low. One way this has been proven to be successful is with the Hawaiian goose. And in 1949, there were only 20 left in the wild, and by 1960, through captive breeding, there were over 600 of them thriving, and that is a tremendous accomplishment. Another aspect of private protection would be through private ownership, and right now it is not legal in the United States for someone to own a certain species. But if we were to make that legal, then sole ownership of that species would be presented to that individual, and that endangered species would be receiving the best possible care and the most attentive care imaginable. So, along with private protection, the ESA should be compensating landowners for the economic loss that they will suffer, and that's according to the Heritage Foundation. Basically, this would this would involve landowners being compensated by the ESA for the economic loss that they would suffer through this confiscation of property. And basically, they would be given the opportunity to cooperate with rather than defy the ESA, and this will help stop unnecessary killing off of endangered species. If these solutions were to be rejected, then first of all, we would lose all of the beauty that Earth has to offer for our generation and future generations to come. And it's no secret that plants and animals contribute to new medicines almost daily, so if the ESA lets a certain species that carries the cure to cancer to go extinct, then we would never find out because the ESA laws and rules were not revised. And in Science magazine, Richard Pombo, who is a former member of the U.S. House of Representatives, he states that without meaningful improvements, the ESA will remain a failed managed care program that always checks species in but never checks them out. Since the ESA has been proven to be ineffective in the conservation of endangered species, here are some things you guys can do to help. First, you guys can go to takepart.com and click on the Take Action button in the top right-hand corner, and this will give you access to tons of petitions you guys can sign regarding endangered species. The second, and probably the most important, is to not purchase any items or clothing or anything made from endangered species. This would include ivory, any type of fur product, sea turtle shells, among others. And if you're wondering, well, how do I know if it's made from endangered species? Well, you can ask the shop owner or the seller where the product came from and, more importantly, what it's made of exactly. And the last thing you guys can do is to volunteer at a national wildlife refuge or visit one too. And if you guys go to fws.gov/refuge, you guys can find locations closest to you. So today we have discussed the problems, the effects, and the solutions associated with the ineffective ESA laws. So if we were all to take Gandhi's advice and consider our animals as much as we do our people, then we could all come together and help stop those endangered species from extinction.